Welcome back to Heightscast, the podcast of the Heights School. This is Rich Moss with you from the campus of the Heights in Potomac, Maryland. We're here to talk about the education and the formation of young men fully alive in the liberal arts tradition. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for continuing to share us, our mission, and our vision of education with your friends. We are most grateful, as always. I am delighted today to welcome Dr. Jason Baxter to Heightscast. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
So just I'll offer just a brief introduction here for you. Dr. Baxter is the director of the Center for Beauty and Culture at Benedictine College. He holds a doctorate in literature from the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining Benedictine, he spent time as a visiting associate professor at Notre Dame, preceded by 12 years at Wyoming Catholic College. His written work includes The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis and A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy, which we shared a podcast conversation on that book a few years ago when that came out.
I remember.
And among other things. And you are currently working on an original translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. And of course, the Inferno is out and available, much to everyone's benefit.
I'm out of hell.
That's right. Anyway, onwards and welcome. Thank you for all your writing, all your thinking, Jason. It's just a pleasure and a privilege to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be back. These are my readers. These are my listeners. These are the people I care about. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so today I was, as always, who knows where this podcast will go. But at least the original intent is to spend some time talking about the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, and then perhaps through that mind discuss a bit of Dante. And then we can close with a discussion of beauty. Now, of course, I'm looking at the clock, and we're going to do all that in 50 minutes. What? Can we?
Yeah, it sounds like if I don't botch it, I'm practically guaranteed an invitation to come back.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I'll keep my coffee close here, and we'll just kind of pretend like we're in the faculty lounge. But so we'll begin with C.S. Lewis. This book is that you've written, again, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, How Great Books Shaped a Great Mind. It's wonderful. And I think one of the reasons I like it so much, published in 2022, one of the reasons I like it so much is because C.S. Lewis is such an important part of the Heights. I was thinking about it recently. The boys in the third grade read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They proceed through some of the other Narnia books. They end their time here with the Screw Tape Letters. Pretty much, I would bet almost every faculty member has read The Abolition of Man. Our upper school head is a huge fan of the Space Trilogy. I think they might read The Great Divorce as juniors. So much of this person's, I don't know. I mean, maybe Tolkien is also really big here, but Chesterton, of course. We chatted with Dale Ahlquist a couple of weeks ago. But C.S. Lewis is a big deal here on campus. He has an interesting style. And I think what this book does is it sort of unlocks maybe the reasons for that style for us as readers and teachers. And so I'm really, really, really grateful. So perhaps one place to begin here is that you've got this great line that a lot of us think of C.S. Lewis just as the essayist or the novelist, but really there was a third Lewis. And this third Lewis we have to understand in order to get the full benefit of the first two Lewises. You describe him in part as the schoolmaster who fussed at students for not looking up treacherous words in lexicons, and I love that. It's like a good encouragement for us to keep doing that ourselves. But just maybe by way of introduction, can you tell us? I mean, who was this? Who was this third Lewis? And loosely speaking, how should we see the connection between this third Lewis and all the stuff that we're reading here on campus?
Yes, I mean the third Lewis is, if you began to describe this individual apart from, attaching the name of our beloved author C.S. Lewis to it, people I think would be very surprised that this individual managed to write anything which has the type of inspires the type of affection and love and maybe even moral and spiritual transformation that you've just suggested is happening even at the Heights. If I told you that once upon a time there was a guy who was an Oxford Don and he hated grading papers and he preferred huge lectures, and his lecture courses had titles like Prolegomena to Renaissance literature, and that he spent most of his days in the archives reading books which hadn't found modern editions and sometimes were even in handwritten manuscript form. And he read books like Jean de Meun's Roman de la Rose and Alan of Lille's Anticlaudianus and Bernard Silvestri's Cosmographia. I know it. If I just keep Martianus, Capella, and Chalcidius's commentary on Plato's, at some point, Macrobius' Saturnalia, at some point, everyone is going to fall asleep. If I just list the books that Lewis thought were weirdly important, and so I mean, part of the sensation and part of the good scandal of this whole project was seeing that Lewis was successful in his Christian essays and his apologetics and his fiction, not despite his day job, but because of it. And that's really the story of the book, and the unlikely story of the book that C.S. Lewis managed to take these, I mean, who's heard of Bernard Silvestris and his scintillating 12th century sci-fi epic, The Cosmographia? Like, no one, right? I mean, not even, not even, not even college professors inflict that thing on undergraduates in medieval literature classes. But if you remember from Out of the Silent Planet, that strange little discourse ends with a philological discussion of the word oyarsis and where does it come from? And the answer is, it came from Bernard Silvestri's Cosmographia. and so Lewis sort of tips his hand and essentially says, hey, there's this thing called story, and sometimes over the course of time, history chooses stories, almost like the earth forms precious gems deep under the surface of the earth, and through enough sort of time and pressure of human failures and human successes and supernatural interventions, and then just a sort of the process of history, the lives of men and the lives of women, their saints, their heroes, become ultimately legends. And these legends are what we know as story. And some stories are so beautiful that they should never die, but inevitably they're packaged in the terms and the language which is available to the day, and those things date. And Lewis seemed to have thought that, like an expert jeweler, he could extract some of these stories, Boethius, stuff from Martianus Capella, certain ideas, certain spiritual qualities, right? Certain what he calls atmospheres. He even thought that some stories didn't even need plots; they could just have a sound or a feeling or a setting. All these things have to be saved. And thus, part of his apologetics and part of his fiction are taking these old stories, again, which doesn't necessarily even restrict himself to plots, but even to feelings and into sort of spiritual atmospheres. And he could rewrite these things just as the jeweler could take the gem and reset it. And in its fresh setting, it would feel so relevant that a bunch of 9-year-old kids in the DC metro area in 2024 would think that it had been written yesterday. But in reality, they're just reading recycled Cosmographia from Bernard Silvestris.
It's amazing. And the interesting thing is that itself, it seems like it's part of the method to take a story that others have written and keep refining it over time. So in a way, he's participating in the method that he studied, where you have these stories that are passed down through oral tradition and improved. And it's almost like he's trying to do the same thing. It's just that it's been such a long time since we've heard these stories that they feel totally new. But I feel like they become newer than they already feel when you realize that this is part of a method that stretches back centuries. It's kind of remarkable.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Part of the argument of the book is not just that C.S. Lewis had medieval content, which he reset and made us realize that this is more relevant than we might have thought, but also that the very process of doing this is not just medieval content, but it's a medieval form of storytelling, right? The whole sort of idea of resetting the gem. Now, what they called it's very interesting because this is a very sort of spiritually loaded word. They called this writing process by which an apprentice writer apprenticed himself to the master even if there were a century separating the apprentice and the master. They called it imitatio, or the wonderful Latin word imitatio. Now, that word, for I bet a lot of your listeners, is going to be very telling, because there's also this imitatio is also used in the spiritual context, right? It's used in the great sort of Spanish tradition of, is also used in the tradition that was based in the imitation of Christ, which is ultimately sort of Franciscan. And so it's very interesting that for us and this fragmented world of us, in which we divide every domain into different academic departments, is kind of a surprise that the same word would be used for essentially a process of moral formation, and also a process of transmitting ancient stories. But for our ancestors, these things were not surprising. And it seems like in a lot of contemporary school context, whether it's whatever the classical school movement or whatever, just any sort of good school, right? These types of elements are being reunited. But in any case, Lewis, the short way to put it is that Lewis was influenced not just in terms of content, but in terms of form, how he told stories, as well as what stories he thought were worth saving. Oh, and if anyone's really, really like in love with this idea of sort of prying out gems from the ancient context and retelling them, there's a 6-page chapter in Lewis's book on an experiment in criticism. It's chapter 5. It's on myth, in which he says that some stories are so perfect that even if they're not told well, we can still hear the kind of spiritual beating heart at the bottom of them. And I think this is the sort of guiding principle. Like, is Bernard Silvestri's Cosmographia, like, should it come into the Heights curriculum? No, it shouldn't, right? It'll just be, poor old kids would just hate it. But nevertheless, there are some stories which are so perfect. The journey, as Augustine talks about it, as I jokingly call it, from caterpillars to supernova, to go throughout the whole world in this hungry quest to find the presence of God. That is a story which is good, even if it's not in a great setting.
Caterpillars to supernova. I may use that when people ask me about, I don't know, the liberal arts, where we study at the Heights, and it's caterpillars to supernova and everything in between. I'll give attribution, but
yeah, that's right.
It's a beautiful
that's
way
right.
of thinking about
it.
it.
And then I'll give attribution to Augustine's Confessions too. Yeah,
there we go. And round we go. So you mentioned the classical schools movement, which is doing so much good. It's interesting that. The title here is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, and yet C.S. Lewis, in a way, he seems to think of basically the world in almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like 2 time periods. You basically have modernity, and then the medieval period, which is Plato until about 1800, and obviously there's kind of like a heart, the kind of the beating heart of that time. Which perhaps was the medieval time that he studied so well. But can you just help us understand that better? It's an interesting concept. I've never thought of it before, and it seems in some ways like C.S. Lewis. I think oftentimes the classical schools movement, again, doing so much good, but there is a study of more than that which is contained within that classical time period. I wonder if Lewis, in a way, he's a medievalist. He loves the medieval period, but he seems to think that period includes so much that came before and so much that came after, and all of that is sort of subsumed into this medievalness that he's trying to restore for us as moderns.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting questions there. And while I was listening to you, I kept thinking, this is great. This is a man who has read my book with care.
Oh yeah, it's a good book. Probably deserved it.
I should just ask him to articulate these things. But I do love this idea of Lewis, because it's something that as I've tried to understand the full implications of this, and as I've got better and better at saying it, I've been myself, and then my audiences and my students and my readers have been shocked by what an astounding claim that Lewis made, that our grandparents' had more in common with Beowulf and Virgil and Achilles and Agamemnon and even the pharaohs and Gilgamesh that is deep into, 4,000 years into the past than we do with them, right? That the biggest dividing line in all of it, and it's an astounding claim, and people don't like it, which for interesting reasons, but it's an astounding claim that the most sort of significant moment of cultural transformation has now occurred somewhere. It's a little arbitrary, right? And it's a process, but somewhere between 1850 and 1890. That is maybe a little bit earlier in a place like Paris, right? If you think about Paris, some people say is the sort of the place where people who are recognizably modern like us, who have forgotten the spiritual world and then forgotten that they've forgotten, is already sort of the sort of social conditions in 1850s, 1860s Paris, like with those Impressionist painters. That's probably why Impressionism feels so live to us, because they're the first ones to really be us. And then it takes a little bit longer to sort of, sort of spread throughout the world, the rest of the world, and then eventually from the developed world to the developing world. But Lewis's argument is that this process, more or less on average, is done by some, or significantly in place, we'll say, by some point in the late 19th century, and that we have become fully modern, which means that essentially we think about that we've spent so much more time around our machines than with the natural world, that we think about the world in terms of the mechanization of the world picture, but we also think about ourselves in terms of productivity algorithms, right? We work hard all day to maximize our outputs and talk about ourselves as if we were computers who have default modes and are hardwired in certain ways and are optimizing productivity, and we're looking for the resources to, sufficiently maximize this output. We have human resource departments. It goes on and on and on. But Lewis's sort of prescient remark in the 1950s when he took the chair at Cambridge was that these metaphors, which have been drawn from machines, but also just the mechanization of the world picture from the scientific revolution, have now sunk into our vocabulary and control our metaphors and thus control our emotions. And this has made us sort of radically different. And this has a number of really interesting effects. One, it explains why it's so difficult, why it was easier. Charles Taylor says this: it was easier for our ancestors to believe in God, not necessarily to be good. That's always been hard for humans, but it was easier for them to believe in God than it is for us, right? For us, belief is the sort of process against the current of culture. But Lewis also thought, and here's where he comes in as a teacher, Lewis also thought that pre-modern text, we'll just say stuff written before 1600 or so, Edmund Spencer, Dante, Homer, Virgil, whatever, right? John Donne. Pre-modern texts are really difficult for us because they were written with a different type of, we could say, psychological paradigm, but one which is ultimately rooted to a whole, I'm going to use a fancy term, a whole cosmic imaginary, a whole worldview about God's relationship to the world and the point of history and so forth. So that's an absolutely extraordinary thing that he claims. And I think that he has huge ramifications for pedagogy, not only in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of how it's actually, pedagogical methods. I think just in terms of the whole sort of like classical school movement, I think that one of the things that will be a real achievement in the next 10 years or so, and I can see the Heights sort of leading the way, is that we're not very good at defining what classical means. And thus you see in really interesting ways, sometimes people say, what is the essence of classical? Is being like Socrates and having Socratic methods, the seminar method. There's nothing more classical. And you think, really? The classical period executed Socrates for the seminar method, right? I mean, like, in what way, right, is that classical? It might actually be valuable, right? But is that really classical? Other people say that classical is the sort of the great books, but this could be everything from Ptolemy to Newton to Moby Dick, clearly not written in the classical period. Some people say that classical is, in the sort of Dorothy Sayers model, right? There's a belief that there are disciplines of learning which are attuned to stages of psychological development, right? The grammar, the dialectical, and the rhetorical. I really like that one. But I think we could keep going in this way, and there basically have been 6 or 7 different sort of moments of classical revival. And so I think what's going to be the sort of exciting, I sound like I'm articulating a book that I'm going to try to write, which I'm not,
Ah,
even though some
please do.
people have talked to me about doing it. But I think what is going to be needed will be to sort of articulate these 6 or 7 sort of compelling definitions, and then to come along and embrace our modernity,
Mm,
embrace not only the spiritual conditions of our world, but to embrace the goodness of modernity. And there is some goodness to modernity. There's some real new spiritual and psychological resources available to us, and we need to harness those, and we need to be honest about what those are. But then it's going to have to be something kind of creative and new, and we're going to have to say, the classical experience of education has been all these things, and we believe that in our particular moment. But I think this is an extraordinary moment in which we could bring modern science and we could bring modern mathematics, and we could preserve essentially the essence of the good of the worldview of the medieval, and then we could amplify the power of that vision by means of our contemporary resources. And this is more or less what I try to do in my chapter in the Lewis book on Lewis and faith and science, because I
yeah.
think he saw this too. I think he thought that it's a shame that we've lost an iconic view of the world. What is the world for? If people could answer that, and if we did answer them just sort of in the streets, I think they would essentially say, well, it's for providing resources for materials that we turn into increasing the comfort of our lives. The world is a set of resources which we can mine, pull to pieces, and redesign. Now, there might be a place for that, for those sort of active goods, right? But I think Lewis thought it was a shame that we have, in the meantime, lost the spiritual vision of what this world is for, its essence, that it functions almost as a great mosaic, an icon for the beauty of God, and that this could be maintained, and it's not necessarily opposed to our contemporary sciences. They could be reintegrated, and I think he was very influenced by his friend Owen Barfield on that. Anyway, that's
Mm,
what I see as the future of the classical movement, the classical
beautiful.
schooling movement, or just we don't even have to call it the classical schooling movement. We could just call it schools that have a reverence for the past, that are inspired by faith, that want to have a sort of a sense of piety for our ancestors, that we believed in sort of abolition of man style, that they had achieved a real good in training sentiments as well as
Mm,
intellects. Um, and we can both and here, which I think is what's so exciting about being modern. And we believe that there have been real goods in modernity, such that if our ancestors had them, if our ancestors had the microscope and the telescope and I don't know, like red shift Hubble style like spectroscopy, right? They would be elated, and they say this is going to help us do what we're trying more to do. Anyway, so I
mm.
think I think Lewis has something, perhaps indirectly, perhaps obliquely, but has some type of really interesting guidance for where this renewal of schooling, right, both classical but also just this whole renewal of schooling could learn from.
Yes, yeah, totally. And so in that vein, I wish we could have 2 or 3 conversations going at the same time. Um, there's a couple of things you say in this book, a couple of quotes of Lewis's and of your own. One from Lewis, you say, Lewis wondered if we shall not have to reconvert men to real paganism as a preliminary to converting them to Christianity. I just think that's marvelous and so interesting. It strikes me that on one side of things, as educators, it's so important, as teachers, it's so important to be thinking about curriculum and the books that we're reading, these sorts of things. On the other, and this is so important as well, perhaps more important in some respects, is kind of the lived experience of the students as they're encountering these books or encountering us in the hallways or walking in the hallways or talking to each other. So it sort of, I know you're a great teacher, Jason. What do you think this line, because this line to me is sort of like one of these great lines you sort of think about and you ponder. We have to reconvert men to real paganism. I like the sound of it. But in about an hour, I got to walk through that door, and I'm going to have 600 boys just being boys. How does he mean this for these guys here, and what does that mean for me as I'm trying to like help them achieve a state that's actually open to true, meaningful conversion to Christianity? So it's a big question. Feel free to take it in any way you like, but I love this line. I'd love your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cool, huge question that, I mean, I think we could have a whole conference on it, right? What does what does the pagan world offer Christianity? Or I just like how we put it. Lewis says this. What are some ways in which we could actually see that as the case? What a hard question. I think he thinks that we have to make people hunger for natural virtues, which our ancestors sort of loved by virtue of their DNA, which we've somehow lost a taste for. I don't want this to become too digressive, but it's on my mind a lot since both you and I are college football fans.
Please.
But I mean, why do we, and a really wonderful team threatening to make the playoffs, right? Our ladies team. Not everyone will agree with this. I understand. But I mean, I think if you ask yourself why have we loved college football, right? Like, why are people willing to donate money to college football in a way that they're not willing to donate to the NFL? I think it's because it's for a while, and I think this is evaporating in a hurry. And my friend and your former colleague Lionel Yosesco says it's already evaporated. Jason, get with the times, and I'm not quite ready to do that. But I think the reason we loved it is because it was in this game. There were still values that existed, right? That fans would go and they would cheer a team whether it won or lost, and if they lost and if we fumbled on the 1 yard line, we would grieve with them in solidarity, and the team would come and we would see that. And that was a value of camaraderie and teamwork and forgiveness and mercy, right? And we would be there with them, right? Or of course, if you won and celebrated, there's something, I don't know, very masculine, very primitive, right? Of this sort of sense of jubilation and euphoria and triumph, right? I think if you begin to ask, which of these things have been natural to the human race over the course of its existence? Maybe not necessarily Christian theological values, but just what we could call classical or pagan values in this sense, right? Well, the love of honesty, right? The fact that I honor a man who will put himself at a disadvantage in his career because he has made a choice on principle, right? What we sometimes call noblesse oblige, right? Or if I've made a promise, I will satisfy it. And if I've broken the promise, I will go back and try to make it right to the extent I can. That's not necessarily Christian. But in our sort of strange secular world, right, in which what this British novelist Paul Kingsnorth calls the machine, right? Religious communities have been the strange last preserve of not only their specifically religious values, but also these natural human values as well. I think Lewis thought that we need to get some of those human values back out of the sort of, the Christian safeguarding and treasury of them, right? I mean, is honesty, let's even say even more, controversially, right? Is chastity a specifically Christian value? Obviously, it's a Christian value, but most of our ancestors, Christian or not, have believed that preserving the sense of purity has been maybe Christianity had a lot to do with, in some sense, bringing to. But obviously, the Romans, right, the whole sort of story of Lucretia, say that we have valued these types of things independently of a Christian theological context for a long time. I think if we had enough time and enough smart minds who sat around and wrote interesting papers, I suspect we could come up with a list of, I'm going to throw out an arbitrary number, 29 classical pagan values, which Christianity has embraced, but are not necessarily specifically Christian theological values. And Lewis's point is that we, through our literature, but also through our lives, through our pedagogy, and maybe this is part of the reason the Heights is so successful, is that we have to make these things attractive again, right? Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, books can help, and interesting ideas can help, and all the sort of rhetorical methods that we use and that we learn as teachers, sometimes we just have by instinct, sometimes we craft them over the course of time. All those things can help too. But ultimately, what the most persuasive way is to see these things embodied in a life, because we're incarnational creatures. Mm. And so when we read about honesty and noblesse oblige and a sense of justice, But then we see men whom we actually admire who have committed themselves to a way of life, even though they might have been, say, financially more successful by pursuing other paths, but they've chosen something for principled reasons because they love ideas and they love people and they love to introduce the two. As Wendell Berry puts his philosophy of education in a short story called A Consent, we admire them and we hunger to be like them. And so I think the cool thing about education, and maybe part of the reason the Heights is so successful, is because it's this wonderful ecosystem in which we have this wonderful ecosystem of types of beauty. We have beautiful books, we have beautiful ideas, we have beautiful poems. But as the tradition pointed out, Plato and Plotinus and so forth, we also admire beautiful lives. And when you can put all those things into the classroom, I think it can make a compelling place where we don't scold people to become honest and just because they're supposed to, right? But we can sort of intuitively make it attractive, and we can awaken some of these natural powers of the human heart. And I think this is what Lewis means by making people pagan again. It means making them hunger for the old classical virtues, which, although they're harmonious with Christianity, it's not like you can't derive them from other ethical systems. That's very exciting to me. It means we have like a lot of common ground to work with. But maybe that also explains once again the sort of the radical success, say especially in the Southwest and in Texas and the Southeast, of all these really interesting kind of educational endeavors, from Valor in Texas and from Great Hearts to Founders and all these. There's a real hunger for this. And I think, again, a lot of this is being fueled by this very comment that we've just discussed in Lewis.
Yeah. Directly related to that, I think, kind of drawing that further, on one hand, there's the need to recover something in the soil that let the Christianity grow and thrive, our own. But then there's also this question of, okay, how do we help this faith, this spirit, this moral imagination, this cosmic imaginary, like how do we help this happen? And I think Lewis is trying to do that in a particular way. This is your sentence, another podcast at some point, but the whole role of Boethius and Consolation of Philosophy is so interesting. But you say that Boethius helped him, i.e. Lewis, find his vocational calling to create literary worlds that did not beat audiences with Christian facts, but rather rendered atmosphere in which Christianity could be seen according to intelligentsia, which you define in a particular way. And then you go on, you quote Lewis. You've got a great big quote from him, which just really resonated very deeply with me as a teacher of boys who you want to feel deeply, but who you can't force to feel deeply. He's commenting on his own childhood. So this is Lewis. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. I finished that sentence and I kind of put the book down because it's such a challenge as a parent, as a teacher. I want my boys, I want my students, I want my kids to love Lewis. I want them to love their faith. I want them to love the Constitution and orthodoxy and a sunrise. But you can't force it. And so I would just love for you to comment on that, Jason, in light of your own experience.
No, you can't force it. I mean, Rich, you've kind of actually moved me almost to the verge of tears. But I think, you can't force it. And you say, okay, so how do you do it? Well, the easiest, that's a tricky term. The most straightforward and the most difficult is what I always say to my students is that we give for free what we already love. We transmit for free what we already love. And so, do you want your kids to be good at the piano? Then you need to be really good at the piano. Yeah. Parents need to stop inflicting piano lessons on their children, which I do. And they need to sit down. They need to sit down at the piano, right? And then, because so much, and this is sort of McIntyre's whole project, right? So much of learning is this, what you could call this pre-learning or this deep learning or this cultural learning, right? And what you could call sort of ethical apprenticeship, right? Mm. That is, if you love the piano, right, and you know it, you'll get the 5-year-old up on your lap and say, "Hey, did you know that this is this is called a triad and this is its first inversion, right? You can do that too, right? Now, how do you put that all together? Well, you can play a chord, block chord, you can play an arpeggio chord, right? And then we sort of like just do that naturally just because it's fun and the kids think it's fun because we love it. Um, Now, we can't love everything, and that's part of the pain of being mortal. It's part of the pain of only having, 90 years to our lives, is that we can't. And but we can love a few things, and we can love them really well. And that I will avoid this whole sort of digression of how our sort of devices slowly deplete us of our ability to love things. But that's another conversation for another time. But we can love a few things well, and then we can bind together into small p political communities, right? Communities in which we admire each other and care for each other, and thus our children can be exposed to other types of loves, other types of ennobling loves, right? Maybe I have I don't know, maybe one of my gifts, this is what people say, and it's very kind of them to say it, is like a sense of passion, right? What Dante called ardore, a sort of a sense of a burning heart. But I know I've been really moved by some of my students, even. They've taught me about what it's like to be humble and what it's like to be generous and what it's like to wake up early in the mornings and go shovel the sidewalk of a teacher's driveway, right? And not seek praise for it. But they're muscular at being good and muscular at being sacrificial in a way that I'm not, right? So I think, how do we do it? Well, we have to love things, and we have to love things for real, and that requires a habitual care on our part and an attentiveness. And we have to be really vigilant about that in our day, because they don't come for free anymore. They might have come free for our grandfathers, right, as Lewis would say. But for us, they're won at a high cost. And it requires a real almost kind of monastic ascesis, and how we spend our time and how we let our seconds and our minutes to trickle away. And we have to be very, very careful with that. But that's another conversation for another time. But I would say that, the third thing, and this is kind of the more specifically pedagogical aspect, and this is also kind of takes us full circle all the way back to the beginning into what was Lewis doing? We have to breathe Narnian air, he says. There's this great moment in one of the books in which the children have been out of Narnia for a while, and they come back and they're a little wimpy. And Lewis says if they hadn't already been in Narnia for 12 hours or so, then they wouldn't have remembered their old skills and had their old sort of sense of kingly and imperial sense of excellence, right? We have to breathe Narnian air. Now, for Lewis, that's a whole metaphor of why we read literature in the first place, is that you take that hidden gem of story and you work it out into a world. And this is also where he's sort of tangentially connected to Tolkien. And on fairy tales, right? This whole idea of subcreation. But you take these gems, and I'm going to change my metaphor here, and you work them out into literary worlds in which we are then immersed and we breathe this air. Now, in some sense, while we're in this air, right? While we're in this literary world, it makes sense. And we begin to hunger for it, not just with the mind, but in the heart and in the veins and the pulse, right? Think about all those wonderful psalms, right? That we hunger for God as the deer, or thirst for God as the deer thirst for streams, right? And thus literature can create, and poetry, right? And art and film, even though I think it's less often, but film and basically great works of art can create these literary imaginative worlds in which we begin to hunger for what they represent, with more ways than just the sort of brain to know. Or as Dante himself puts it, Beatrice tells him, you realized that the mind has not understood until the foot moves, by which he means if you see it and if you hunger for it, then you'll immediately move out to grasp it because you'll want to incorporate it into your life. And this is something that's just fresh on my mind because I've been writing about it in my new book, Why Literature Matters, right? But I say that beauty is the experience in which we recognize the gap between who I am and the beautiful thing out there. And beauty is propelled by the desire to close that gap so that I metabolize it, I internalize it. And if that's what the experience of beauty is, then it makes sense of all those strange passages in Scripture, right? Where God when he commissions his prophets, like say Ezekiel, doesn't say, learn these principles, but he says, here are my words, now eat the scroll. And Ezekiel eats it, and he says, and the scroll tasted to my mouth like honey, right? We're supposed to metabolize these things. And I think that Lewis thinks that that's the peculiar genius, the secret kappa element, he calls it, the krypton element. That's why story matters, and that's what it can do that syllogisms cannot. That you can create these atmospheric worlds in which we enter and breathe and begin to hunger for the closing of the gap with all of my senses. And in this way, I slowly engage in what he calls elsewhere the thickening up process. And I become better at being human, not just a brain that knows correct opinions, right? But one who has them integrated in the very sort of, cellular tissue of his being.
Okay. So much of that strikes me, another line from this book as related to the education of the heart. And you, again, this is your quote: traditional education was as much an affair of the heart as of the mind. An enculturation is the way of honor, love, sacrifice, and integrity. And so to me, it seems like beauty has a really important function as we're trying to engage the hearts of our students. And maybe in that vein, to achieve or to offer beauty, Dante, let's see if I can find that quote here. One of the things that Lewis loved about Dante is in Dante, in Lewis's words, the chief characteristic of Dante's poetry is, and here's a Lewis quote, almost sensuous intensity about things not sensuous, which is a great, maybe that's like the waking up, the kind of the,
that's right.
Having scales fall off eyes to realize like, oh my gosh, look at all of the things. They're incredible.
That's right. That's
and
right.
So, and it maybe was that part of your interest in offering us another translation of Dante and finding a new way for us to experience this great work. I'd love to introduce it, for you to introduce it to us and just help us frame up our reading, which will inevitably follow, I think.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I love this. Yeah, so my new translation, man, there's lots of things to say about it. Yes, I think Dante thought that he was writing a poem which couldn't be forgotten. And it couldn't be forgotten because he thought, unlike other poets, he had created a poem which was rooted in the body and rooted in the nerves. In part because he used his daily tongue of Italian, right, the vernacular, as opposed to the classical Latin. But in part because he used some words which in previous iterations of his life, he thought that you would have to avoid. Now, some of these are indeed obscenities. I'm sure every high school boy copy of Inferno has like a couple of words highlighted, right? He does, have some obscenities, and he has some curse words, and he has some scatological things, and that's in there. But in an earlier iteration of his life, and this is how I put it, he wanted to write what I called the perfect poem, all caps, the perfect poem. And he thought, and he sat down, and we have this thing which I jokingly call Dante's diary. The reality is it has a very boring academic Latin title, De Vulgaria Eloquentia, on the vernacular of the eloquence language. But I call it Dante's diary because it seems to me that we sort of caught him in the middle of his notebooks as he was trying to think out of his life mission. And what he seemingly wanted to do was write a 100-line poem in which he praised Beatrice's beauty. But the form of the poem, how it felt, that what types of words he used, the spacing of it, the rhyme scheme would be so perfect that it would enable people to feel sensuously about non-sensuous things, the intellectual beauty of Beatrice. And so we find that Dante's sort of working this out, and he says, okay, what do? Well, you have to use words like this. You have to use these 3-syllable words that have these lovely combinations like amore, desio, virtute, or 4-syllable words like securtate, donna, corpo. All these are good words, he says. And then there's a huge list of words and even types of sounds that you can't use. He says, avoid double Z's, avoid double X's. You'll sound like the Genovese, right? Avoid mushy consonants, right? And he makes fun of all these people. and he tells this story that his exile from Florence, his political exile from Florence, has put him in a favorable position because he's gone around Italy and he's gathered all the perfect words from every region, and he's just about to write the perfect poem. Well, the next thing we see him write is the Inferno, which is dark, which is haunted by an apocalyptic beast. It's cold. He talks about how he's like on the verge of having a panic attack. It's physiologically in tune with his body. And then what I discovered, and this is what I think makes the translation special, is that he uses what he said he wanted to use for the perfect poem was a spacious, gliding slowness, what he calls with the Latin term prolixitas, right? In which it would be ample, right? And sort of slow moving. But the reality is what he writes in Inferno is this film noir paratactic thing in which line after line after line after line after line after line proceeds almost as if it's an elevated heart rate. He uses lots of conjunctions. He says edinde, 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 and then, as if he's trying to speed the whole thing up. In other words, he violates almost every single rule that he said he would have to do for the perfect poem. Now, that was super interesting to me. And for me, that's sort of connected to this larger idea. And I get a little apocalyptic in the introduction. I was writing it in an election year. And so I was very anxious about everything going on. And so it put me in a great state to write about Dante's world, which is also very much like ours. But I think Dante thought that his world had reached a point in which it was coming unglued. It was morally unhinged. And it had even lost the ability to be moved by beautiful things. It had lost the ability to be moved by the old Boethian harmonies. And thus he would need something more like a surgeon on a battlefield. And he would need a new power of language, of linguistic power, which would crack through this exterior crust of our hearts and create the capacity to hear those old harmonies once again. And so if that's the goal, then how did you do the translation? My translation is, everyone says it's very energetic. It's very almost kind of linguistically forceful, right? It's not obvious to an English-speaking ear that a double Z or a double X is a harsh sound, because we come from Anglo-Saxon and Danish, and we just got loads of those types of sounds, supplied to us. And so what I try to do is I take our short sentences and sometimes make them even shorter. I have some one-word sentences. I have some things which just sort of pop and feel like things are sort of breaking down. And so, as I say, I have these sharp, angry clauses, which are hard and sharp and heavy, and make something which is not just making a point on the intellectual level, but we can't but feel in our pulse and in our heartbeat and in our nerves. And so far, I'm very gratified to say that so far the sort of people who have read it have said things like, I don't know if I've read the comedy before. Reading, I've read it in other translations, and there's lots of good ones, and I admire lots. But at least this type of energy, I think, sort of restores something which existed in the world of Dante, but also I think it sort of updates it, and I think it's particularly good for students. It makes it. Some of my students have very graciously even said they were reading it like a novel, that they couldn't put it down. It was just so exciting. They didn't know what was going to happen. But I think and I hope it feels that way, I really do. But if it does, then that's the sort of deep thought of the kind of cognitive, psychological, linguistic vision that underlies the translation.
That's awesome. That's great, because it can be a challenging work, and I think it's interesting to see the different emphases that can be placed by the translator as he's bringing Dante's Italian into our own language. This sounds like a really, really important work. You mentioned that Dante said people in his era were not affected by beauty, and maybe that's part of what you were trying to offer us, is take this great work, put it into a beautiful language that can strike us. And so maybe if we might, I'd love to end just with a conversation about a couple minutes at least about beauty. You're now the director of the Center for Beauty and Culture at Benedictine College. Beauty has come up a time or two during our conversation, as has the heart. I don't know what to ask, but I'd love to hear you share a little bit about, okay, beauty and education. There's this idea of beauty wounding the heart. In what way does it wound, and how does that educate us? It seems it's an interesting metaphor, because typically we don't want our students to be hurt or anything like that, but and yet we're setting up these purposeful encounters that that create these moments where, like C.S. Lewis writes about in Surprised by Joy, of just kind of this longing, this wound. How does beauty wound, and how does that educate us?
Yeah, I love that. The woundedness. Well, I mean, that is, as Lewis himself would put, it's all in Plato. Right? What do they teach? What do they teach kids these days in school? And that, of course, is the myth of Aristophanes, in which Aristophanes tells this absolutely wild myth in the middle of the symposium. Right? He is a comedian, but I always tell my students, this is the moment in which your hilarious college friend. I've got a guy in mind from University of Dallas, and I won't mention his name, but I think he comes from your world. He's probably your roommate, or your classmate. Your sort of hilarious friend has this moment in which he actually wants to say something serious, and everyone's laughing at him because he's really done nothing in his life but tell jokes. But this time Aristophanes means it, and he has this hilarious, weird kind of thing which my students get really icked out by. In which once upon a time there were these strange globular units, right? And man and woman are sort of glued together, and they're this one being. But then, because they try to rebel against Zeus, Zeus cuts them in half, right, and makes them independent. And what it means is, for the first time, they feel this sense of woundedness. They're incomplete, and thus the whole phenomenon of love begins. And because they're incomplete and they're wounded, they're trying to seek a sense of fullness. In Aristophanes' story, is they're trying to seek, a more completion that comes from romantic and married love. I'm sanitizing this a tiny bit for our audience.
Those of us in carpool,
right? But it is, it's a hunger. Obviously, love is a hunger of the heart, and when we have this experience of falling in love, it's a very strange experience in which we all know. Those of us who are married remember it, and in which it's dizzying. It's almost like a sense of nausea and sort of shortness of the breath and the diaphragm, but we wouldn't trade it for anything. And Plato just jokingly reflects on this, like, why would you want this sort of diseased state, right? But this is the sense of woundedness. And for Plato, it's not just love, but it's also the whole phenomenon of beauty. And Plato says the only correction that Socrates offers to this is that your picture is just a tiny bit too small, Aristophanes. It's not just between the love of a man and woman and the desire to be united forever, but it's really the human being's relationship to the divine and to the eternal. And beauty is analogous to falling in love. Beauty is the extraordinary moment in which we recognize that this thing that I want is more than I can handle. And when I have a sense of beauty, if I've seen sort of Teresa in Ecstasy of Bernini, or if I've heard Arvo Pärt's My Heart's in the Highlands, or read Gertrude Schnackenberg's Supernatural Love, or read Richard Wilbur's Advice to a Prophet. These are the things that are on my mind that I've been writing about in my Why Literature Matters. But in any case, if I've had those experiences, then the strange experiences is one of woundedness, in which I find myself saying to myself, even if I don't articulate it quite in this way, I don't know if I've ever really lived before. I don't know if everything that has come up to this moment has had this sense of fullness. And I've just been going about in my sort of usual day. And I don't think I've got this kind of deep thing. Roger's writing about this too in his book on wonder. I don't know if I've got this deep thing into the core of my being. That's the essence of the experience of beauty, right? And that's what you talked about as the sort of experience of woundedness. And that's what I've been gotten so excited about lately, and what it means, and how you teach it, and how do you try to integrate it into college students' lives, because there's obviously a lot of concern and anxiety over high school students and college students, right? This is the Jonathan Haidt anxious generation. We know that. But what's exciting to me is that for all the sort of corresponding anxieties and neuroses is this hunger, this thirst for an experience of beauty, and they get it. And this is what I've been working on and thinking about lately.
Beautiful. Well, I gosh, there's so much more to talk about, and I fear we just we've scratched the surface. But I think in a way that's kind of the point of the podcast medium, is to scratch surfaces that hopefully whet the appetite a little bit. But
Well, it's a real compliment to the ideas we're discussing if after 55 minutes we've only believed we've been scratching.
That's right. That's
so
right.
here's to Lewis and Plato.
That's right. Amen to that.
55 minutes does not exhaust you. Yeah.
That's right. And Dante, and to you for bringing him back to us.
And to Dante.
Really, just taking it back to Lewis, just grateful for this book. I mean, those of us who have wondered about the imagery in Out of the Silent Planet, or The Great Divorce, or The Abolition of Man, Chronicles of Narnia, there's all of it. There's so many places here where I kind of was reading, and I said, oh my goodness, okay, that's where that comes from. Interesting. And you'll read Lewis in a new way. And so I think for those of us who do read Lewis to our students or our children, cannot recommend this book enough. Also, it's very beautiful, by the way. It's beautifully typeset. It's a lovely book.
Yes.
So anyway,
it's also beautifully read on Audible.
Yeah.
The wonderful English reader Simon Vance gave me a major upgrade. And I mean, to be totally honest, I would listen to Simon Vance read the phone book of Dallas, Anderson, Adams, 9728. But he did a magical job on this. He doesn't butcher any of the foreign terms. And I'm really excited about that as well. That's just sort of an added dimension to this book's life.
Excellent. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I'll read it through Audible a second time. Dr. Baxter, you write for just people who are just right in our wheelhouse, who love the liberal arts, who love the tradition, who love being in the here and now, sharing this with the next generation. Where can our listeners, parents and teachers, just trying to do their best, where can they find you? Where can they learn more about your work?
That's right. Yeah. I have a website. It's jasonmbaxter.com, and it has sort of links to some of my writings. It also has a new link to my Substack, Beauty Matters, which is just launched this week, and I'm excited about this endeavor. One of my first pieces was called How to Die in Sardinia, in which I describe a near-death experience of mine, true story, but also why I weirdly loved it. And why, if I could get my wife's permission, which she's already told me, no, thank you, I would do it again, because I came very close to. And anyway, so I used this kind of travel writing experience to write about this experience of beauty, and a bunch of Lewis sort of shows up in this. So my new Substack, Beauty Matters, is also kind of an exciting thing, and that's going to be tied to a brand new book, which is launching next week, called Why Literature Matters. And I'm trying to do a fun experiment. I've got the book, and I'm excited about the book. It's a short book, Why Beauty Matters, Why Literature Matters. But it's connected to. I'm going to create a set of augmented, hyperlinked footnotes on the Substack, so that if you're reading along in the book Why Literature Matters, and you come across something and say, "Oh, wow, I'd like to know more about that." Say I mention, Mendelssohn's Overture to the Hebrides, or I mention John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine, or I mention Mark Zuckerberg's Open Letter, and poems by Yeats. I've got all that stuff sort of hyperlinked and set up on this Substack, so that it's sort of an enriched experience. And I know it's digital, but in a way, I'm kind of thinking of it as a super medieval thing. I'm sort of providing the manuscript illuminations as well as the glosses and the commentaries to the original text, and so that's kind of fun. I think. So I would say if your listeners are excited about this, and the Lewis book is the obvious place, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, but also this new book, Why Literature Matters, and the Substack Beauty Matters could be beneficial to folks as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. We just recorded a podcast a couple weeks ago with my colleague Joe Breslin, who you might know, on the title of that one was Why Fiction Matters, Why Fiction. So it's great. I think it'll be of keen interest to our people. But we'll have links to all of that, the Substack, Beauty Matters, Dr. Baxter's page, and links to all these books so you can bring them into your own home, your own classroom, your own consciousness. But Dr. Baxter, it's been a great pleasure, as always. Really thank you for your time and all your work.
Yeah, I'm grateful. I admire you guys and think you're doing amazing things. And yeah, keep up the good work. You're doing the real deal. You're in the trenches.
Doing the best and in them together. So thank you. Thank you very much, Jason.
Goodbye.
That's it for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. Our thanks also to Dr. Baxter for his time, his friendship, and just these wonderful books that he's written. In particular, this one on C.S. Lewis. I think those of us who are teaching this great writer and thinker would do well to check out this book. If you're interested in beauty generally, do hop onto Jason Baxter's Substack page. A lot of really great writing that's happening there. So our thanks to him once again. To support the work of our own faculty here at the Heights, we're doing our all to share these images of beauty, of goodness, of truth with our students. Please do continue to support the Heights financially. To do that, visit heightsforum.org, click on Give. Everything you do is incredibly appreciated while you're there. You can also sign up for one of our segments, emails. These are monthly emails that go out to parents, teachers, or school leaders. We'll talk to you in that capacity here. You can also see the latest podcast from the Heights Forum Faculty Podcast, and this is going to be an episode featuring 3 Heights teachers who left non-educational careers to come here and teach. We actually have a military doctor, we have a law enforcement officer, and an attorney who all left those wonderful professions where good people are very much needed, but left long careers in those professions to come here and teach. So it's a great episode. Check that out. Visit heightsforum.org. Support our work. Listen to a good podcast. Sign up for an email list if you like. Either way, however you engage with this stuff, we hope you have a fantastic Advent. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.